Okay, we're gonna talk just a little bit about acoustics. I'm gonna try and keep this video really simple, and that you can branch out from this to understand what you think you might need for your production. In Wikipedia here, the definition: a science of sound. Now you have to really pay attention to that phrase, because science of sound means exactly that: science of sound. So whenever you're talking about sound, the way that a lot of people see it is, you're dealing with acoustics and, acoustical issues, which sometimes it really isn't that. It isn't that, because they'll say it that way, but really you start looking at different aspects of sound and what's going on, that your brain and the industry and people don't really look at that as acoustics. They're just not looking at it that way. But it is, as far as a definition, a science of sound. What sound is, how sound operates, what sound does, how sound interacts with different things. There you are. So you've got a science of sound, including its production, transmission, and effects, including biological and physiological effects. That's a huge arena. You're talking about the production of sound. The production of sound. The transmission of sound, there's your signal flow, and effects, anything that can be affecting the sound, anything, so, you really have to kind of look at that statement and understand what they're saying there when they're talking about acoustics, the fundamental concepts of acoustics. And secondly, that most of the time when you're talking about acoustics, when I hear people talking about acoustics, in recording, mixing and mastering music, a lot of times they'll be talking about those qualities of a room that together determine its character with respect to auditory effects. And I'm not going to say that's all the time, but a lot of times. So that way, when you hear somebody talking about acoustics, if they're talking about the science of sound, its production, transmission, the effects, how sound affects different things, or how different things affect sound, that whole concept is huge. So, but a lot of times it's a lot more simple, that they're talking about the room, frequency responses, impulse responses, delays and reverbs, and spatializations, and all kinds of things like that. Most of the time when I hear people ask me about acoustics, that's what they're focusing on. That's what they're asking about. Because you start trying to explain to them the science of sound, that's not what they was asking. So, you have to understand the kind of the difference, of what those two things can be. But, a lot of times it can be real simple. You've got like diffraction, interference, reflections. Those kind of things are very pertinent in your sound, early, late reflections, diffractions, and interferences in your room, or things you're trying to create in your DAW to create ambience or to create some type of acoustical effect, spatialization. Those things are very pertinent, and you should look them up. And also refraction, you need to look that up and understand what that is, and how that can be affecting the acoustics of your production. But we're going to get right back to some basics that, acoustics can be the response of your room, frequency and sound, both those different things, the impulse response and the frequency response of the room. And it can be like, where is the person sitting that's listening, and where is the sound coming from, and at where directions, and that can be a huge spatialization of, that is dealing with the acoustics, as far as where you want to place mics and things like that. When you're doing your basics, of a good capture, before it goes into the DAW, that some of those things need to be taken into consideration to get a good capture that you want. And the other thing is that when you get into the DAW, that, the acoustics, science of sound can be different than, dealing with the room, but they can be interconnected. Because, you've got one plug-in that you're trying to do something with, and it's deadening the sound a little bit, because it's trying to emulate some analog thing, or it's got this hot, brighter end on it by the time the sound comes out, because it's doing something to the higher frequencies that are boosting them or something, and some distortion or whatever. That is all interconnected to the acoustics, it just is, fundamentally, that it really isn't when most people are speaking about it, but in reality it actually is. So you have to kind of think about that. And when you're dealing with adding reverberations and delays and spatializations in your audio, that, you have to remember also that in that acoustical context, that you're dealing with two speakers. And a lot of times you might be dealing with two cheap earbuds or two cheap computer microphone or speakers and things like that. You obviously want to mix your music for an audiophile so that, it's as good as it can be. But a lot of times, a lot of that stuff's going to get lost when you truncate the information to an MP3 and dither the shit out of it or something like that. That I'm sorry you spent all that time, on all that spatialization. It's gone, dude. They ain't gonna. You'd have been better off, but spending some more time on your panning and spending more time on some delays, doubling of tracks and maybe a real light reverb or a different, specific type of reverb and very lightly in there to retain clarity so that it doesn't get muddy and lost in the mix anyway. So those are huge things to take into consideration. So I hope I've approached that because it can be a very complex issue and it can be very simple depending on what application you're talking about. If you're talking about the acoustics of your room, you're talking about be there for the most part, and if you're talking about a science of sound, well, we've already talked about that, and you definitely need to understand sound, and they're directly related and interconnected in ways you may not realize. That with a little bit of reading that you will have a little bit better understanding of how they're interconnected and how they relate to each other, so that when you're doing things in the DAW or you're doing things in the analog world and how things can be affecting the audio, that it's directly affecting the acoustic quality of your production. Drastically sometimes, and sometimes really bad ways where you'd have been like, oh, no, don't even push that button, dude. I don't want that affecting my audio because I know when I get done with this whole mix that it's going to have an adverse effect that's not highlighting anything. It's adding more mud or something like that, rather than, doing what it's supposed to be doing and highlighting what's going on. You trying to look at, acoustics like, you're looking at a symphony, you want to acoustically treat this place for this symphony, that, that's not going to happen out of two speakers, bro. It's just not. It's not going to get reproduced well, and at best, lightly, that it can give it some good spatialization, and it can give it some nice tonal qualities because of its frequency response and the impulse responses and reflections around it. But too much of it is going to muddy your mix and make a mess of it. So you have to try to understand to break that down to where it's much more basic for the format that it's going into and what it's going to be being played through, so that, because you can't reproduce it in the arena you're working in, so you really have to sit down and think about that, because there'll be a lot of times that I'm dealing with reverb or spatialization and I'm using very simple techniques because I know when I get it put on the MP3 and it's coming out my computer speakers or something like that, that it ain't going to do any good. It's going to get lost and, and sometimes even make it sound worse. By the time it gets truncated and dithered and all kinds of garbage, by the time it gets done formatted, that, it really has not done any good to what I was trying to do. And, it made it worse. Whereas I went back and removed all that crap and put on some very simple spatialization things and reverberations and delays that, very simple and very, low level, with the idea of add a little bit. You can always add a little bit later, and not overdo it, that it actually come out sounding much better like that and had a much better sound. And, and that can be very, very true. So keep that in mind whenever you're dealing with those acoustics. And, another thing that I wanted to talk about is some software tools to understand it. While you're reading about it, there's a bunch of tools, but here's one like this one is called REW and it's free. And you can download this tool, and if you just play around with it for a while, and I'm not getting into the tool much, but if you just play around with the tool a bit, maybe a couple weekends in the evening or something like that, and play around with the tool and understand what it's doing and what it's trying to show you, you're going to get a little bit better understanding of what those things are. so that, you know, when somebody says acoustics, you can ask, you know, are you talking about the sound of science, bro? Or are you talking about, you know, treating the room and just room acoustics? And where are you going with that when you say acoustics? You know, I mean, what are we talking about, and what area are you speaking of, so that I can understand what you're talking about? And messing around with this, that some of those concepts, you know, will be a little bit clearer to you. And you can find some other software, other free software, other bot software, all kinds of visualizations of acoustics and what that means and what they're doing, you know, to really help you. But I mean, even like this one, that, you know, you can get on it and mess around with it, you know, just play around with thing, have fun, you know, understand what some of these things are, what it's doing, and what it's trying to show you. You can take a frequency response of your room, you know, and what's going on with the, you know, the frequency response and the impulse response, and what does it mean? How is it seeing that, you know? So when I'm looking at it on my, here's my impulse response, I just put in my convolution reverb. Oh, that's nice, bro. What is that? You know, what is it doing to my room? All right, well, there's what it's doing to my room. How do I equate this? What it's going to do coming out of two speakers, you know, and what's it doing to the rest of the mix in there? You know, does that make sense? And I know that might sound ridiculous, but that's very true, because, you know, you're trying to look at spatialization, and a huge 3D realm when you're dealing with two speakers ain't happening, you know, and you might think it is, but it really isn't. So what is that doing to the audio? How is that getting interpreted by the audio in the environment that you're working in it and with it? And what is that going to mean? You know, and so that you're looking at things a lot differently, going, well, I understand that, but that's what that's trying to do. And in the environment I'm working on, it's not going to do that. It's going to do something else, you know, and to approach it that way, so that you're looking at your acoustics and the acoustical treatment and processing of your audio in a way that is, you know, with a little bit better understanding of what those things are trying to do for you, and when they're a good thing and when they're a bad thing, and when to use them and when not to use them, and things like that. And so I hope I kept this video real simple, and I'm hoping that it just opens a door for you to have a basic understanding of it, so that, you know, when you get a little bit of a basic understanding of it, that those concepts aren't, you know, baffling to you and confusing, to where that somebody starts talking about acoustics, that you can be real specific about, well, what's he talking about acoustics? And, you know, when he starts talking about something or something new that's going on, you know, that might be very pertinent to what you're doing in your type of production, that, you know, you've got a basic understanding to understand what these things are trying to do to enhance your mix, and when they're not, you know, good, and you want to avoid them. So I hope that opens up the doors for you, so that you can, you know, get a little bit better understanding of that, and, you know, go play with this tool a little bit, and then have some fun. And when you get done, hopefully you've dug around a little bit and played around with this tool, and maybe some other tools, or maybe even bought a cool tool. And so that when you're recording, mixing, and mastering, that the concepts there, that you understand what, you know, it's actually doing to your audio, and how to deal with it, you know, when you know, how to deal with acoustics, and how to apply acoustics to the production, and what type of production you're doing. So I certainly hope that opened up the door a little bit, and I hope that was fairly simple and easy to understand. And peace, hope, love.